Up to this point, most of what Rebel Wolves had shown for Blood of Dawnwalker was focused on combat, Cohen's human versus vampire identity, or individual quest design. That stuff was definitely important, but this third reveal finally answered a much bigger question. What does Veil Sangor actually feel like when you're not locked into one major story mission? So here they focus a lot on the open world. They pulled back a bit and showed how the world they've created actually works and how they flesh out each area. They touched on how so many mechanics are tied into each other. What stands out is how these mechanics seem to keep feeding into one another, really. The more aggressively you survive, the more corruption you build, the more you interfere with vampire control, the more your infamy rises. And well, with the time mechanic as it is, the more time you spend progressing, the more the world keeps moving forward. So by this point, Dawnwalker starts looking like it's aiming for something bigger than a dime a dozen basic open world loop. And it's starting to look like a world that really expands and rounds out how all these factors can influence the way you play. One of the first things this reveal does surprisingly well is establish that exploration may actually be fun. It might actually have structure beyond just filling a map with Ubisoft icons, or at least that's what I'm hoping. When Cohen reaches that first early vantage point, it immediately gives a clearer sense of how they want us to read the world. Instead of just highlighting random locations, the map starts surfacing different types of opportunities that appear connected to different systems, so you see areas tied directly to different characters and officers. Each special location seems to exist to help your character grow, so for example, shrines look like they're based around travel and progression, while the haunted sites they talked about look more connected to magical growth and special items. The officer-related locations seem built around sabotage and just fucking around with different factions. So at least from what they've shown, exploration looks a little more intentional than simple Ubi slop. Movement was a big standout for me as they focused on Cohen's abilities during different times of day. So at night, Cohen can unlock a wolf form fairly early, giving him faster movement and more agility while crossing larger spaces. During the day, there's a separate human alternative through Mercurial Fervor. Basically, it's his gotta go fast mode. And that might sound like a smaller detail, but it keeps the day and night split relevant even when you're just moving through the world. So, Cohen's form doesn't just affect combat or story routes, it seems to change how exploration itself tends to feel. So whether you're hunting, investigating, or simply trying to reach your next objective, time of day still appears to shape your options in a meaningful way. I'm hoping each mode actually feels different and it's not just a sort of day or night skin. Then they moved on to open world encounters with a classic trope we see in most open world RPGs. So, you find a group of civilians getting attacked out in the world. But what I like about it is that you aren't forced to do it. You can just be an ass and walk away, or you can get involved. According to them, each choice can lead to different consequences. A bit of their Witcher pedigree started showing through here, as even these small encounters get a bit more weight than the usual random event design most open world games tend to lean on. And so, Cohen intervenes, opening up with a move they call Death from Above to immediately gain an advantage before the fight even begins. It's also a nice moment to show that they actually listen to player feedback. They added an option to quick select abilities. This will definitely let combat flow without having to pause everything to check for menus and options. But what really makes this section more interesting is what happens after the fight. Cohen, being a half vampire, gets his health back by feeding. So, as a good vampire, he doesn't have to go straight for human blood. He can feed on animals if he wants, but they tend to be less effective. So your choices tie immediately into survival and into progression because feeding also builds corruption. And corruption unlocks stronger vampire perks or abilities, so even something as simple as that feeds into how you develop Cohen over time and creates a pretty interesting layer where these encounters aren't just about killing NPCs, but also about how you handle these situations. And of course, I'm hoping there's still some breathing room for that. I mean, who doesn't like to do a full evil psychopath run at least one time in this type of game? Then they start focusing on a few other aspects. Shrines, for example, ended up being one of the more interesting reveals because it seemed to sit right at the intersection of exploration, progression, and how you manage your time. Instead of just being a random open world checkpoint, it has its own mini objective, where Cohen has to follow a trail, track down some soldiers, and eventually get back the item they need to make it work. It gives you a reason to actually have to explore something in a game. Who'd have thunk it, right? Actual real things to do in an open world game and not just finding 75 different fast travel points. And even then, there's more. Once the shrine is rebuilt, other bigger systems start showing themselves. So yes, of course, it works as fast travel, but it also becomes a place for a progression. In their demo, Cohen finds a manual that unlocks a new perk, but that's not enough. He still needs the right experience, and actually getting that perk consumes a segment of time, directly connecting to progression pretty significantly. Everything you do means time keeps moving forward, which could potentially affect objectives, the world, or future opportunities. So these places that were usually just a random buff in other games become something much more central to the game as a whole. I think they're one of the clearer examples of how all these systems seem to overlap. You know, exploration leads to progression, progression costs time, and time keeps pushing the whole thing forward. I'm really into how all this meshes, and I hope it actually ends up mattering. One of the more interesting, larger scale systems they showed here is Infamy. Mostly because it doesn't just look like a background reputation bar you can forget about. So, as you commit crime, in this case sabotaging and attacking soldiers or disrupting blood supply systems, you gain infamy. But instead of just changing how guards react to you, it affects the entire region. The rulers can make new edicts, basically raising your wanted level. They mentioned that this will make the world more oppressive as a whole, maybe even making whole factions drop you, try to kill you, or maybe providing unique perks or abilities. They also introduce officers in a more meaningful way. This time they showed Ambrose, who will change how he treats you depending on how you've messed with him before, with entire quest lines opening up depending on what you did. I'm thinking it's something like the Nemesis system we see in Shadow of Mordor. In that game you could mess with orcs so much you could even make them go crazy with fear. Or you could fuck up and make them super powerful and almost impossible to kill. If it's anything like that, then provoking specific enemies can unlock new narrative paths all through the same action. So I'm hoping this makes Vale Sangora feel a little more reactive, and most of all, a lot more fun. But I still need to see more. I think the warehouse section really starts to show how important side quests will be rather than standard open world filler. It looks like a generic enemy camp at first until you see that they're full of blood supplies, blood that was drained from the townsfolk and then stockpiled. A bit of world building and extra details that give you some actual drive to get through the area. The whole point to attacking one of these sites isn't just to loot resources. Well, it definitely is, but it also has a bigger purpose by interfering with your vampire overlords, and mechanically this keeps feeding back into other systems. Sabotaging these operations raises your infamy and damages their standing, and eventually pushes officer aggression even further. So again, one activity keeps feeding multiple layers. Combat, world building, all that stuff really matters. That's probably one of the more promising signs here, because side content often lives or dies based on whether it feels disconnected from the larger game. At least in this reveal, Rebel Wolves seems to be pushing the idea that these activities are tied directly into long-term consequences. If they can maintain that variety across all these different areas, it could make Dawnwalker's open world a lot more interesting, but that's only one type of activity. Here's hoping they add a lot more to it all. By this point, what really started standing out to me is that Dawnwalker's day and night system really seems to be laying into player choice, because sure, on the surface, human by day and vampire by night obviously changes your abilities. We already know that. But what this reveal started showing more clearly is how that split may actually change the way you think before you even engage with something. At night, Cohen feels like he can move through Vale Sangor with a lot more confidence. You're faster, you're more mobile, more aggressive, and in a lot of situations, probably more willing to take risks. There's this sense that nighttime probably encourages you to act more directly, so you see an opportunity and you go for it. Daytime feels a bit different. Not exactly weaker though. When human Cohen is out in the world, there seems to be more emphasis on how you prepare for something, or how you go about investigating and approaching situations, and NPCs with a little more care. Even from the footage, daytime sections feel like they come at you with a different pace. I thought that was pretty cool. They're basically creating two characters for you to play. Just depends on which one feels better for you. One encourages your speed and instinct, the other more caution and planning. And I think that will make the clock feel way more meaningful, because choosing when to do something could become just as important as choosing what you do. And that's hopefully more than just a gimmick. Now, I'll be honest, combat was one of my bigger concerns in the earlier footage. I'm sure it was the same for a lot of you too. The ideas were there, but some of it looked a little stiff and a little too menu heavy. I wasn't fully sold yet. This third reveal, it's definitely better. Not perfect, but better. What stood out most wasn't necessarily one flashy ability, it was that combat finally started looking like it flowed, more naturally moment to moment. That quick select change was a pretty important improvement. Removing the constant pause immediately makes fights feel less stop and start, less clunky. When Cohen jumps into combat now, there's a better sense of momentum. It looks like you can chain abilities more naturally into movements and attacks instead of looking like separate systems that are awkwardly stitched together. Now the combat itself also looks a lot more refined. Sword strikes, blocks, and parries seem to have a good sense of weight now. And this is something I think they really needed to show. Open world combat lives or dies on constant repetition. Hell, The Witcher 3, which everyone is obviously going to compare this to, had pretty meh combat. The game was great at the time, and even now really for so many things. Combat, at least for me, wasn't one of them. It was very loose, even janky at times. So here, if players are constantly fighting outside main quests, the basic feel has to hold up. It can't just be flashy, it can't just be mechanically interesting, it has to feel good over time. So this footage at least gave me some more confidence there. Whether it's using any of the vampire and magic abilities, combat seems more readable and responsive now too. More like something you can actually play around with and learn. I'm still a bit on the fence, but for the first time, the combat actually started looking like something I want to get into instead of just going through the motions, hoping to find the next interesting area or just keep up with the main story. Putting it plainly, I don't need it just to look cool. I need it to be fun and to look cool. A lot of RPGs introduce plenty of mechanics, but they often feel like each one is separated into their own little box. Exploration sometimes exists separately from progression, side quests feel disjointed or even unnecessary. Even combat can seem like an afterthought. Here, the more interesting part is how often one mechanic seems to push directly into another, in some way or form. You explore shrines that let you unlock perks, but of course you can't actually get these without letting time pass, and if you let time pass, then the world around you changes. Again, I'm hoping these changes are actually meaningful, and not just a slight variation in dialogue, or a slightly different item you get. I also really like how what you do with NPCs can have an overarching effect on the types of skills and abilities you get. Even being an ass lets you open up new quests with Infamy. Also, their map looks pretty big. I just hope it's not empty. The Veil itself looks like it changes depending on what decisions you make, so I hope this aspect is more than just PR talk. So right now, the most promising part of Dawnwalker's open world isn't necessarily its size, it's the possibility that your actions may consistently ripple outward, through multiple layers of progression, politics, and the world as a whole. At the same time, this is also where the biggest questions start showing up, because mechanically, they are presenting a lot, particularly around dual progression, day and night loops. There's clearly no shortage of ideas here. But having strong systems on paper is very different from sustaining them across a full RPG. My biggest concern right now is whether these mechanics will keep evolving, or whether they'll eventually just start repeating themselves over and over again. I mean, how many shrines before the process starts feeling like a hassle? How much variety exists between haunted sites beyond combat and magical rewards? Will officer activities meaningfully differ depending on who you're targeting, or will they eventually just blur together into just run up a wall and stab a guy? That's going to be the real long-term test. Hopefully, they've got plenty of new things in mind, and new ways Veil Sangor can react. And not just in the way it looks, but how everything around it actually could change to fit your playstyle. There's also the question of balance. Adding a timer can be interesting in theory, but only if it's used strategically. I just know if you get punished for learning a random move or because you wanted a bit of extra cash, players are going to get frustrated. And its complexity could even be something of a double-edged sword. It might just feel bloated once we get our hands on it. So right now, it's looking like a good spiritual successor to The Witcher, because it quite obviously is, right? So after this third reveal, Blood of Dawnwalker feels much bigger than it did originally. At first glance, the human by day, vampire by night concept is what grabs your attention. But this open world showcase is where they really started showing what matters. Improvements. Them actually taking feedback on and not just doubling down. Now, the only other issue that came up are the system requirements. I mean, I like that they're being frank with it, even making sure to note that this is based on using no upscalers and no frame gen. Even then, I feel like needing 12 gigs of VRAM just to get 1080p at 60 FPS seems very unoptimized. I mean, a Ryzen 9 7900X for 1080p at only 60 frames? That's a little nuts. I'm not sure what kind of crazy graphics they're working with, but from what we've seen, it doesn't look like it should tax mid to high range level hardware so much. Well, either way, I guess we'll see how it goes once early impressions start coming out over the next few months, because the game itself is coming out this year in September. Only 5 months from now. And yeah, I think that about covers it. I just want to give a huge thanks to all of you for watching, commenting, and helping the channel grow. We're getting pretty close to 250 subs, which is honestly kind of crazy. If you've been enjoying the content, feel free to like the video and subscribe. It genuinely helps a ton, especially because there's a lot more coming soon. So, thanks again, and have a great one.
There might be another way. If you are to stand a chance, you need to prepare.